Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 39, Postcyberpunk and Transhumanism. This is the third episode dealing with the punk subgenres of sci-fi. Except, as the name implies, this one isn't about punk itself, but rather what grew out of it. In fact, I believe post-cyberpunk is the most modern branch of sci-fi. By that I mean, although there have been a lot of great books over the last 20 years throughout the genre, post-cyberpunk is the one that most distinctively showcases 21st century ideas, even though it started in the 90s. Post-cyberpunk, in simplest terms, is a reaction against the negative excesses of cyberpunk. It keeps the same technological projections of things like human augmentation and the hyper-connected digital world, but it drops the dark and gritty aesthetic, dystopian themes, and anti-establishment attitude of cyberpunk. Instead, it posits that future society will be, if not positive, then much the same as it is today, going through upheavals from the breakneck pace of technology, causing a lot of problems in some areas, but also being a positive good in many others. Social structures, government, corporate, and otherwise, may be troubled and even overbearing, but they don't have that dystopian bent. They're still trying to do things right, at least as much as real-life society is. You can draw your own conclusions there. Now, one derivative of cyberpunk that I did not mention in the last episode, Solarpunk, has a lot in common with post-cyberpunk. Solarpunk posits a green future, with a healthy side of social justice, in which many of today's problems have been solved. That doesn't sound very punk. It was actually TV tropes that explained it in a way that made intuitive sense to me. Where post-cyberpunk posits society continuing more or less as it is now, with both the good and the bad and leaving us to use the system to improve society, Solarpunk advances the anti-establishment idea of overturning the status quo and replacing it with something better. The website solarpunkanarchists.com, yes, really, expresses it more concisely. Quote, "Solarpunk is a revolt of hope against despair." Unquote. Solarpunk is a very new and emerging subgenre, still disproportionately driven by Tumblr, although some older works have been grandfathered in, most notably Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed and several Studio Ghibli films. However, the most notable work that could possibly have anything like a conscious solarpunk aesthetic seems to be Black Panther, whose Afrofuturism overlaps strongly with the concept. Post-cyberpunk itself is more mature than the original cyberpunk, but more real-world and a little more cynical than solarpunk. But there's another piece to this puzzle, because post-cyberpunk also overlaps more strongly than any of the other punk subgenres with the idea of transhumanism. And this is where it gets complicated. Transhumanism is a real-world philosophy that also has a large presence in sci-fi. At the fundamental level, transhumanism advocates for enhancing the human condition through new medical, cybernetic, digital, and artificial intelligence technology. The thing is, transhumanism is a very esoteric field, and it's easy to fall down rabbit holes like rationalist fiction, abolition of suffering, and the simulation hypothesis. It also tends to get steeped in weird, non-standard terminology, like extropianism and agalmics, that only people in the field can understand. I mean, seriously, I've looked, and I do not understand what the difference is supposed to be between transhumanism and extropianism. Classical cyberpunk also overlaps with transhumanism, based on cybernetic enhancement of humans and the extension of human ability through augmented reality. And because of this, many cyberpunk works will be listed as transhumanist, or at least quote-unquote transhumanism in fiction. However, I think this is wrong. Again, the difference is one of attitude. Classical cyberpunk does not have the optimism of transhumanism, nor the overt drive to use technology to better the human condition. That is very much a post-cyberpunk and solarpunk idea. On the other hand, transhumanism can be a somewhat broader idea than post-cyberpunk. Even besides being a real-world philosophy, it's frequently less social science fiction than post-cyberpunk is. Transhumanist fiction tends to focus more on the technology, especially when it casts further afield with things like mind uploading. So keep in mind that while I'm associating post-cyberpunk and transhumanism because of their major similarities, they're not quite the same thing. This episode was tricky to write, in part because the line between cyberpunk and post-cyberpunk is very thin, and my definition, that it involves a clear break in terms of attitude, isn't going to be held by everyone and isn't going to be applied consistently. Is Snow Crash post-cyberpunk? I think the Diamond Age is, at least. Is Ghost in the Shell, which was written even earlier? What about Werner Vinge's A Fire Upon the Deep, which isn't even about this stuff, but still contains a lot of the same ideas, and was written by the guy who coined the term technological singularity? It's also tricky for other reasons. This is a very new subgenre, so it's not canonized in the classics yet, like the earlier eras of sci-fi. And there's the fact that many of the concepts are not widely known and need a lot of explaining. To cut through all this, I think the first major novel that really digs into the idea of transhumanism as we know it today is Permutation City by Greg Egan, written in 1994. Permutation City is partly a transhumanist story about mind uploading, digital copies, and the potential problems that may result even in a supposedly post-scarcity society. In particular, computing resources are still limited, and economic inequality means that poorer digital people can't afford to run themselves in real time. But much like Egan's other works, Permutation City is also a work of physical and mathematical philosophy. It hinges on two real, but kind of fringe theories of physics: quantum immortality, and what Egan calls dust theory, which prefigures Max Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis. Quantum immortality is honestly really hard to explain clearly. The short version is that in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, every possible universe is happening simultaneously. Thus, if you die in this universe, then somewhere in the infinite quantum branches, there's a path where you didn't die. And you will always perceive yourself as being on a path where you survived. Now, explaining why this makes sense would take more time than I have here. And keep in mind that there are a lot of ifs in there. Maybe I'll write an explainer post about it. The point is, Permutation City's protagonist, Paul Durham, is a digital consciousness who has tested the quantum immortality hypothesis by repeatedly deleting himself, yet surviving because of improbable coincidences every time. Meanwhile, the mathematical universe hypothesis suggests that every self-consistent mathematical structure exists as a universe somewhere in an ultimate multiverse. Egan's dust theory goes even further. If you calculate the mathematical structure, for example by simulating it, that calculation is that universe, and quantum immortality will ensure that it continues after the simulation ends. Durham takes advantage of this to start his own new universe that isn't subject to the limitations of computing resources on Earth. And trust me, Egan can get a lot weirder than this. Several of his books are set in universes where the laws of physics are so different from ours that they're barely comprehensible. Now, this early transhumanism was joined by other works that address it only as a side topic. Stephen Baxter's Zeely sequence features a major character, Michael Poole, who is an uploaded human. Sometimes they are negative and perhaps unintentional portrayals of the topic, like Star Trek's Borg. The Diamond Age does it a bit with the Drummers, who integrate humans as nodes in a distributed computer system. Ian Banks's Culture series fits very well, with its biological augmentation of humans and ultra-powerful mind AIs. And Richard K. Morgan's Altered Carbon, which is classical cyberpunk, is also classic transhumanism, with its uploading-based immortality. A similar case of this from recent years is Anne Leckie's Imperial Radich Trilogy, also known as the Ancillary Trilogy. This series is pretty standard space opera, but it's notable in that the first-person narrator is herself a transhuman, or maybe even post-human. Breck was once Justice of Torin 1-19, a cybernetically enhanced human body integrated with the computer system of a vast troop carrier warship. and the only survivor after the ship was destroyed. I say body because the cybernetic implants used by the ship destroy the original personality and sense of self that inhabited it. Specific personality quirks will slip through, but the mind is entirely replaced with that of the ship. In the Radchai Empire, these augmented bodies are called Ancillaries. All Imperial warships will carry a few dozen of them to act as the hands of the powerful central AI, performing maintenance and acting as domestic servants for the crew. And the huge Justice ships carry thousands of Ancillaries as soldiers. It's not entirely bleak. Recent reforms are seeing Ancillaries replaced with human soldiers, although it's less convenient for the ships as they can only interact with their crews electronically. Anyway, Breck sets out on a mission of revenge for the destruction of her ship body and the death of the human officer whom her section of the ship's mind was programmed to love. And her path sees her caught up in events that leave the future of the entire empire hanging in the balance. Lecky's great experiment, though, is not the transhumanism. Rather, it's how she played with gender conventions in the series. The Radch has a genderless language. Lecky said that she wanted to portray a society that simply doesn't care about gender. Not in the way we do with language, anyway. And unlike Ursula K. Le Guin in The Left Hand of Darkness, Lecky uses exclusively female pronouns for people, except in the few places where Breck recounts a foreign language being spoken. Now, some people debate whether that was the best way to challenge gender norms, but the effect is striking. Because we're so used to hearing male as the default, it makes you rethink everything when you hear everyone using default female. And without overshadowing the rest of the story. It all works together really well. Also, if you read the Imperial Raditz trilogy, I particularly recommend the audiobook version by Adjoa Ando. Her characterization really brings the story to life, and her interpretation of the Radchai language is brilliant and makes it sound so much more distinctive than if you read it in print. The thing is, all of these books, most of which date back to the 90s, are only one part of the subgenre. What you might call low transhumanism or core post-cyberpunk. Although that's just my own opinion. This is the realm of brain-computer interfaces, cybernetic augmentation, and basic human-level AI, for the most part. There may be super AIs, but they stay in their lane in a mostly recognizable society. There's often life extension, and there may even be mind uploading, but it doesn't redefine the human condition like you would think it would, at least not on screen. As I alluded to earlier, transhumanism is a broad and complicated philosophy. And in the mid-2000s, another branch of it was gaining steam. Singularitarianism. Yes, that's the actual name. Which takes the whole idea to even greater extremes. In fiction, it may even end with everybody being uploaded into a vast computer system the size of the solar system and transformed into super AIs in their own right. This is basically the ascend to a higher plane of existence trope, which is of course a very old one, perhaps born out of religious ideas. The singularity is sometimes called the rapture of the nerds, after all. However, the transhumanist vision of it as something achievable with plausible future technology is much newer. If you're a sci-fi fan, there's a decent chance that you do know what the singularity is, but not necessarily. It's something that has deep ties to rather esoteric corners of the tech industry, and a casual reader may well not have encountered it. The singularity is based on the projected growth of computer technology, with the theory that sometime in the next few decades, it will see a runaway growth that results in it becoming off the charts more powerful basically overnight. Although the singularity might have better been called the event horizon, being the point beyond which we cannot see because it's beyond our comprehension. The word singularity is used in a mathematical sense, where the equations divide by zero, but that's not necessarily a sign of infinity. Instead, it means that our models break down, and we just don't know what happens next. In simple terms, the idea of the singularity is based around Moore's law, which is not a law but a rule of thumb in the tech industry, that computers get twice as fast every 2 years. If this is able to continue long enough, and that turns out to be a big if, then eventually you'll have a computer that's smarter than a human. But that computer will be able to design a computer that's even smarter than it in less than 2 years. And then it turns into a runaway growth process that theoretically shoots up to infinity. Some naive versions of this idea suggest that computers really will reach infinite speed and complexity. That with dedicated effort, new physical principles will be found that allow this, transcending silicon and as unimaginable to us as an electric motor would be to a caveman. More realistically, it simply says that human-level AI combined with self-replicating technology will allow us to bootstrap up to a rapid paradigm shift unequaled in all of human history, but not using new physics. In practice, this makes little difference, as the extreme conclusion is still on the level of dismantling the planets to create Dyson spheres made entirely out of computers, also known as computronium. Of course, all of this depends on many factors that are far from certain. From how forgiving the laws of physics are, to whether we can crack biological immortality or mind uploading, to whether even the most hyper-advanced post-human civilization would find it worth the trouble to build a Dyson sphere. Or for that matter, whether the idea of accelerating returns even makes sense in the first place. Vernor Vinge seems to have been the first person to use the term singularity to refer to AI in a 1983 nonfiction essay. He used it more clearly in its modern sense a decade later in another essay, The Coming Technological Singularity. The idea was then adopted lock, stock, and barrel by inventor and futurist Ray Kurzweil, most notably in his nonfiction books The Age of Intelligent Machines, The Age of Spiritual Machines, and his 2005 book The Singularity is Near. As this idea was percolating through the tech industry, it was also gaining traction in sci-fi. And this led to the quintessential first Singularity novel, which is widely considered to be Charles Stross's 2005 fix-up Accelerando. And you don't even have to buy this one. In the spirit of the internet and his character Manfred's dedication to open source, Stross has put it up for free to read on his website. Accelerando was written as a series of short stories from 1998 to 2004. The first one is set in the early 2010s, about 15 years away at the time. Close enough to see where things were going, but far enough for some of the predictions to look pretty wild today. The province of a Google Glass early adopter at best, although that's certainly in Manfred Max's character. It looks pretty ridiculous to a normal person, and indeed in Chapter 3, we see from a normal person's point of view just how insanely plugged in Manfred is, taking in a stream of data that seems to do 10 things at once, leveraging the bandwidth of his eyes and ears to the hilt until it looks positively hallucinogenic. And he's so reliant on the cloud that he barely knows his own name without it. The digital structure he's built around himself is more his identity and personality than his own body is. And that's just the start. The book traces a path through the entire 21st century, and things only get weirder by the decade. Stross wrote a retrospective crib sheet about the book on his blog in 2013, in which he said that he started with the fairly easy predict future of just 15 years hence, but extended it to the deliberately extreme case of what if the singularity actually happened? And of course, he suggested it wasn't as rosy as the transhumanists would have us believe. He's also said in other posts that the book was a product of its time, and he now takes a more mature and skeptical view of the singularity. However, Stross's conceit of the naive, hard takeoff is integral to the book. It's probably why he's so bullish on Moore's Law at the beginning. He predicted that we would have the first human-level AI by 2020, and his version of the Internet of Things definitely needs some pruning. Manfred mentions his shoes getting fooled by 419 scams. Stross also adapts other sciences like astronomy to suit his needs, like dark matter actually being a result of the majority of the universe's mass being converted into Dyson spheres, and large-scale intergalactic structures being an effort by some unimaginably powerful civilization to hack space-time itself. The main story of the book concerns Manfred, his daughter, his grandson, and of course their various digital copies, as they become tied up with these events, initially staying on top of them, but eventually being overwhelmed and struggling to keep themselves and a recognizable version of humanity afloat. Granted, few books go to such extremes as Accelerando. It's such a radical change from any form of reality we normal humans can understand, that it's hard to make an entertaining story out of it. The closest other example is probably the Jean Leflambeur trilogy by Finnish author Hannu Rajaniemi. The Quantum Thief, The Fractal Prince, and The Causal Angel. The Quantum Thief takes place centuries after the Singularity, where the post-human inhabitants of the solar system have settled into a long-standing conflict between two factions. The Sobernost, who pursue the transhumanist dream of digitally resurrecting all the humans who ever lived, and the Zoku, who dismiss mere copies as not being true resurrection and embrace the transient quantum nature of reality. Jean Leflambeur is an infamous gentleman thief who currently exists as millions of digital copies in a prison that subjects him to endless literal prisoner's dilemma games in an attempt to reform some version of him. One of his copies is broken out by the Sobernost so that he can perform a heist of some kind for them. And it gets very complicated. They spend the whole first book on another heist to get Jean's memories back so that he can do the main heist. But this book also shows the craziness that can ensue in a fully digitized post-human environment. Another interesting case is Peter Watts's Blindsight, which was published just 1 year after Accelerando, and parallels it in some unsettling ways. This is kind of a weird one, not least because it breaks Wells's law that sci-fi should have only a single extraordinary assumption. First, you have this strange alien visitation that the crew has to investigate, but then, independent of that, you have scientists somehow digging vampires out of humanity's genetic code and cloning them. These vampires are not the supernatural kind, but an ancient predator race that supposedly once roamed the earth and hunted humans, hidden among them yet different from them, with their traditional characteristics encoded deep in our cultural memory. There's a lot of weirdness about them that doesn't make much practical sense. But that's not the point. Blindsight does have brain-computer interfaces, AIs, and the like, but the unsettling part is how it comes to a similar conclusion to Accelerando, that the Singularity might not be such a good thing for us humans, even transhumans. In Accelerando, the problem is that Economics 2.0 utterly dominates capitalism as we know it, but it's so complex that the only beings that can understand it aren't recognizably human anymore, or even recognizably conscious. And the humans, even mere uploaded post-humans, get left behind. Blindsight takes it a step further and suggests that even in natural biological evolution, consciousness is an inefficient way to do things, an evolutionary rut that humans got stuck in, while most species develop intelligence more like a supercomputer. Immense processing power with the learning and problem-solving skills of a human, but all done algorithmically and without self-awareness. Now, many thinkers in this field believe that consciousness is an illusion to begin with, that human minds are purely algorithmic themselves, while still being dedicated to improving the human condition and recognizing the intrinsic value of human beings. These ideas are not contradictions to them. But the haunting hypothesis of both Blindsight and Accelerando is that even if it is deterministic, consciousness is too resource-intensive to compete in this universe. I feel like this idea is a combination of the fundamental incapability of humans to imagine entities smarter than we are, and our existential dread at that fact. Or maybe it's that part of us that I alluded to way back in episode 10, which instinctively feels that something valuable and indispensable is lost through the creation of a hive mind, however powerful it is. And to some extent, the hypothesis is justified. In a competitive environment, conscious beings can plausibly be outcompeted by entities that are not conscious but have better algorithms. We see this in things like AlphaGo, which can beat humans at games that are too complex to solve deterministically, even in principle. But personally, I think it remains to be seen if a program can compete in the massive anti-inductive system of the global economy without being conscious, or if it can, that it can't have a conscious mind bolted onto it. The truly optimistic view, which I find more plausible even though I don't fully accept the premise, is that post-humans would operate at a strictly higher level of consciousness, greater than but still containing everything that we mean by human consciousness. just like we humans still have our so-called lizard brain, and it still has a significant influence on our behavior, even though we've heaped a lot of other equally valuable stuff on top of it. Bringing it back around, post-cyberpunk has of course continued past these singularitarian novels. And I can't pass this by without covering a novel I've mentioned several times before on this podcast, Existence by David Brin. I don't know if Brin himself considers Existence to be post-cyberpunk, but I think it fits the definition. And I know that it deliberately takes a cautiously optimistic view compared with classical cyberpunk. Existence, as I've said before, is one of these big, complex stories with a lot going on, and I love it. Most of it is set in roughly 2050, and it has a sprawling, multi-threaded plot centered around a mysterious first contact with aliens, but spreading out to give a street-level view of how strange and alien our own future has become. There's lots of new vocabulary and slang like AI-ware for the ubiquitous wearable technology everyone uses, which I think is the best example I've ever seen of an author trying to imitate how new words spring up all the time on the internet. There are tantalizing hints of the historic upheavals that have gone on in the preceding 4 decades, such as the cryptic references to a nuclear terror attack known only as Awful Day. Then there are the genetically modified dolphins who rescue hacker Sander, revealing the story to also be a loose prequel to the Uplift universe. In short, it blatantly breaks Chekhov's rule that everything in the story has to be relevant to the story, and that's precisely what makes it so good. It really makes you feel like there's a whole world hidden behind the curtain. And even among big, complex epics, I think the only other works I've seen that do it this well are Stand on Zanzibar and The Wind-Up Girl. Existence begins with Gerald Livingston, an orbital garbage collector trying to clean up space. So things like the recent Russian anti-satellite missile test, it's his job to pick up the pieces. But one day, he picks up something that's not supposed to be there. Something not even human-made. A strange, crystalline alien computer, seemingly populated by digitized aliens, which brings a message for humanity. Join us. And the world is thrown into chaos. All the usual fears of alien encounters, social unrest, political conflicts, you know the drill. Some people want to follow the alien message and join them, while others are skeptical and want to keep their distance. Especially since the longer they look, the more there seems to be something sketchy about it. It gets even more heated when a second alien probe is discovered that says the first probe is lying. And some people just want to take advantage of the chaos to, for example, overturn the system entirely and bring back the aristocracy. Yes, really. A bit of spoiler for the book here. If you don't want to know anything going in, skip ahead about 2 minutes. So, this is what I think is the biggest weak point in Brin's writing. His idea of the threat of a deliberate, conscious rejection of the Enlightenment and modern science and technology. I think it's a possible failure mode of society, but not one anyone is trying to do, even with the religious motivations he ascribes to it. Populists trying to replace establishment experts with their superior ones? Sure. Would-be warlords hoarding technology? Definitely. But not out-and-out neo-Luddites, which is what Brin portrays. And it's pretty much resolved off-screen in the book, too, so it's handled oddly for such a large plot thread. Existence also has something of the same warning as Accelerando, though in both more relatable and more optimistic terms. A self-aware interstellar chain letter, optimized by genetic drift to be convincing enough to ensnare unsuspecting civilizations and replicate inside them like a virus. But unlike in Accelerando, the intellectual resources of an entire planet, including nascent AIs, is enough of a counterweight to resist the comparatively small resources of the chain letter. And Brin writes a lot about this sort of thing. In the real world, he warns that the greatest threat of artificial intelligence is not some Skynet-like military system, but rests in super-advanced high-frequency stock trading algorithms, which are designed to generate the biggest profit by any means necessary. This is perhaps the closest to Stross's idea that Economics 2.0 would supplant human civilization, and an idea that inspired my own short story, High Frequency. Okay, spoilers over, back to business. As usual, the books I've mentioned here are just the major points. Wikipedia's list of transhumanist books, well, first it includes a lot of nonfiction, with Ray Kurzweil being only the tip of the iceberg. But there are quite a few more novels, films, video games, and so on. Probably the most famous examples from the past couple years are Ernest Cline's new novel Ready Player 2, and the 2019 film adaptation of Alita Battle Angel, both of which I've reviewed on my blog. And since this episode is already really long, you can check those out for yourself. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available in too many places to keep track of, but the main ones are Libsyn, my host platform, YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. And of course, you can also find me on Twitter at SciMeetsFiction. For my book recommendation for this episode, it was a really close call between Accelerando and Existence. Both of them have a lot going for them, and the Imperial Redditch trilogy is really good too, but that's space opera. As I said, Accelerando is sort of considered the definitive first novel about the Singularity, and Stross does a good job of showing just how crazy things can get there while still telling a good story. But singularitarianism isn't the whole of post-cyberpunk, or even the whole of transhumanism. And I think to get a broader view of the theme of this episode, I am going to recommend Existence by David Brin. Existence is definitely in the spirit of post-cyberpunk, and it's more up-to-date by a decade. And I think it examines the future in more dimensions, for lack of a better term. It's more realistic futurism, rather than pushing the limits of what could happen, and it does more to address the problems of today, where Accelerando has the Singularity pretty much wiping the slate clean. Plus, it is just a top-tier novel for me. I've said at least once before that it is my gold standard for the big, really immersive epics that I've raved about with Stand on Zanzibar, Snow Crash, and The Diamond Age, although it's more optimistic than all three. All of that would have been enough to recommend it, but there's one other reason you should take a look at Existence. In the next episode, I will be interviewing David Brin. I'm excited about this one because this is the first time I'll be interviewing an author whose books I've already discussed on the podcast. As usual, we will be discussing his views on sci-fi and writing in general, and having seen him speak before, I'm sure it'll be a good time, so be sure to check it out. Thanks for listening.